Welcome to Theater 14A, Horror and Science Fiction. It's the online version of the class, and this will be the lecture for the very first session of the class, and I'll be trying to put these in on a week-by-week basis. So first of all, we want to ask and answer, what is a horror film? A horror film can be a lot of different things. It can be a monster movie, which we'll be watching plenty of those. Ghost stories, we'll be watching those too. Zombie film, watching a couple of those in the class. Teeny Kill Pick, which is another name for a slasher flick. Serial killer thriller. And Space Monster Shoot 'em Up, which is something you're more likely to see when you get into the sci-fi part of the class. But once again, it's another type of horror film. All of these can be horror films, so it's a relatively flexible genre in that respect. Now, the origins of horror, and we're actually going to move before film even existed, well beyond that. We want to look at some of the ways that people frightened themselves before they started watching movies. So folklore, oral and written history is the first stop here. There's Beowulf, which was a Nordic oral tale, which was finally put down into print in the Middle Ages. Which is a monster story, essentially. The Bible, which is full of monsters and demons and things like that. Medieval legends, dragons and griffins and all sorts of other things. History texts, ignorance and fear of the unknown equals the supernatural. This is kind of the crucial combination here, because of the fact that when people ran out of knowledge, they didn't know what existed behind or beyond a certain place. Well, they had to imagine what happened next, and most of the time their explanation was going to be monsters. And this is before science, before medical science, things like that. So people had to rely on their imagination, and a lot of times that ended up with monsters of the supernatural being the explanation. Now, Gothic literature is another good example of horror origins. So you have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1818, definitely a very important seminal work here. Also Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1897. And Edgar Allan Poe is probably our first real genreist, our first horror writer. Before Stephen King, we had Edgar Allan Poe, and the Raven is a good example of that. But pretty much everything Edgar Allan Poe wrote was a horror story to a certain extent. Also popular stage productions. And when you think of the movies that were turned into, or the movies that were created out of Frankenstein and Dracula in particular, they didn't come from the original novels. They actually came from the popular stage productions which were made in the 19th century. So these were obviously adapted and changed considerably so they could actually fit into a normal theater run, and these were a little bit easier to turn into movies than the original novels. So if any of you have seen the actual full adaptation of Frankenstein from the 1990s, it's kind of a mess. It doesn't really work that well. The same thing with the Francis Ford Coppola version of Dracula from the early 90s as well. Sometimes the stage productions were a more compact and an easier version to view the story. Now, early versions of film, or early examples, we have German Expressionism, which is a particular artistic movement in the early 20th century. We have the Golem, which is kind of a Jewish Frankenstein story, very a common story, and that theme gets used fairly often in Jewish literature. Also the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is notable because its set design actually looks like German Expressionist paintings. Nosferatu, which was an adaptation of Dracula. This is the one with the bald Dracula with the rat fangs and the long fingernails. And then in 1931 we have the birth of the Hollywood horror film, and that was the year that Universal Pictures produced both Dracula and Frankenstein. Though at the time the term horror didn't actually exist. It actually took those films being made and becoming very popular that the term horror actually existed. So the popularity of these two films is what actually made horror as a genre exist, and people started making more films, and bada bing, bada boom, we now have the horror film.